Hello, hello.
Hello.
Welcome to the Smarten Up show here on lemnetwork.tv.
We are Darryl Milena Weinberg of School Pods Canada and soon, hopefully, School Pods International.
Well, we have been working, different ideas of how to address the needs of families, how to help families in education and parenting and just navigating through today's life and in our society. So the as we are growing, as we're meeting with more families and speaking with different people, we will be spreading the idea of the just parents having a choice, not having to choose one thing, but having different options of how to raise their children. It's almost like we have lost, I guess, the idea that we can choose for our families, and this is what we try to bring to you week after week, that you can choose for your family, that you don't have to go with what's prescribed. It's interesting for someone like me who comes from communist country where we didn't have choices and we came to Canada because there were so many choices. I remember coming to Canada and going to a grocery store. Now you have to remember that 1990, 91, when communism went down, just before that, um, the stores were empty in Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
There was no food supply. And if it wasn't for the fact that people were agricultural and they grew their own food, we would have starved.
Yeah.
And so and just the stores, the shelves in the stores were just an example of the lack of choice that we were given of what to do. We were supposed to speak certain way and eat certain foods and live certain way, and government owned everything, and you just did what the government told you, which is kind of reminding me of what's happening in Canada nowadays. But
that's exactly what's happening in Canada. I mean, you have the stepson of former Prime Minister of Canada, who belonged to the Communist Party before he joined the Liberals. And the only reason he joined the Liberal Party is because he couldn't get elected as a communist. But Pierre Trudeau was through and through a communist. And his biological father, of course, was the leader of the communist revolution in Cuba and led that country for 40 some odd years or whatever it was.
So yes, the communist tradition is very strong here. But this wasn't a show really for us to talk about communism. I guess the reason I started talking about it is because I wanted to contrast it with the fact that we have choices.
Well,
and whether the political regime doesn't give us that, we still have choices.
Yeah, you just have to be smarter about it. That's all.
Well, that's why our show is called Smarten Up.
Well, exactly. And if you look at what's going on, what's making all the news right now is about Columbia University in New York.
Yeah.
And the fact that you have literally thousands, if not tens of thousands of students that are protesting for Hamas. They're openly saying that we support Hamas and that there is violence against Jewish students. And even a rabbi said that the Jewish students should stay home because they're in danger. Well, this is exactly what happened in Germany back in the 1930s.
Well, in our last show, we did talk about the importance of teaching our children history and how different social groups interacted. Because if we don't study history, we'll repeat it. And obviously, and interesting that history is being repeated here in North America after the push to, I don't know how long ago, it was a few years ago, there was a push to destroy monuments that
well, it was during the BLM riots back in 2020 and 21.
Right. So it wasn't that long ago. And so And I don't think the monuments were the issue, but what they stood for. But then not only those monuments were being destroyed, but it was now textbooks were being modified and so forth.
Mhm.
And I know, as I keep on top of what's happening in education, the public education system here in Canada, I know that there is a rule for the public school boards that if a book is over 8 years old, I believe it is, it could be taken off. And so they're kind of renewing the books. And so, in the schools, books are not being replenished to reflect the cultural history of our country. And
Mhm.
so new culture is being brought in through the literature and so forth. And so if we don't learn history, it's interesting how it is starting to repeat. And so for the older folks with a little bit of gray hair like us who have studied history are surprised that if within our lifetime what big change there is in the narrative of how history is being presented.
Well, and last week we discussed the quote from George Santayana, who was the Spanish American philosopher, and he said, "Those who don't learn from the past are doomed to repeat it," because the same tactics are used by tyrants throughout history in order to gain control.
Well, if they worked the first time around, why wouldn't they work again?
Why change?
Why wouldn't we do it again? It worked.
Yeah.
Um,
So, and just going back to the Columbia stuff, and Columbia is not the only issue. I mean, it just happens to be at the forefront right now in New York City, which has got the largest Jewish population outside of Israel in the world.
yeah.
But I mean, we remember the hearings in Congress of three different school presidents back in the fall that ended up leading to Claudine Gay, who is the president of Harvard, a DEI hire, having to resign because she could not condemn the anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic protests that were happening. She refused to condemn it. And then it all of a sudden came out, of course, she was a plagiarist and everything else and was completely unqualified to be the president of one of United States' most prestigious institutions. But you're having this go over, all over the place. And the public education sector, and this is why we do what we do.
That's why we
And
have School Bods Canada.
this is why we have School Pods
Where's our
Canada.
little
And
sign there?
where to go?
It just got to disappear momentarily, but
Get back.
there you go.
Yeah. And so, not only do we have public education not teaching our kids a good quality education, they're
Mhm.
actually teaching them to hate.
Well, and this is kind of like the whole when we started seeing our society drastically change and values change quite quickly and quite drastically, to the point where now even young families are feeling old fashioned because they don't want their children to be learning certain things. And again, that's why we started School Pods Canada. Um, and when I saw this whole virtue signaling, like, yeah, we stand for something, we make it sound good, but if we don't have a solid foundation of knowing the history and knowing good what are good values, that kind of timeless good values, then we will stand for something that is not good.
Mhm.
And a big example I have with my own family is that my grandparents on my father's side, they were devout communists. I mean, they were partisans during the fascist regime in Eastern Europe,
Yeah.
and they were hiding partisans and all these people um, who were opposing and were trying to overturn the regime. And you know what? They did a great job because
Mhm.
fascism definitely wasn't good for Eastern Europe when the Nazis came. Um, but then what happened is they brought in communism, which also didn't work out
Turned out
so
to be oh
great.
so much better.
Well, but the thing is, and I keep saying that, it's because of what they believed, denied spirituality and God
Yeah.
and good moral values. They ended up falling for a belief
Mhm.
that wasn't good for people to begin with, was just something that seemed progressive and modern, but
Well,
not good
listen,
necessarily.
communism and fascism are two sides of the same coin. They're both tyrannical. They're both state control. One is more racially based. The other is supposedly egalitarian, which is completely untrue because there's still racism. Racism. within communist society. It's not official, but I mean, ask Jewish people how they were treated in the Soviet Union, and
Right.
they'll tell you, not so good.
Well, and because when certain people are labeled as the enemy or somebody like, and so when you follow an ideology and somebody's labeled or somebody who stands in the way of your ideology,
Yeah.
all of a sudden, all animals are equal except certain animals are more equal than others, and it becomes that. And it goes back to human nature. We want to be recognized for what we do, and I remember during communist time, again, my mom had university education. She was a dentist. She obviously had to study a lot more than somebody who was doing construction work or something like that, but she was receiving the same salary.
Yeah.
So if it wasn't for the social recognition, money wise, she was not motivated to do that extra education. But education was a big value at the time, so people ended up getting it despite the fact that it didn't bring them money.
Yeah.
Now, again, why are we laying this foundation and this background? Because today we wanted to talk about family traditions and following family traditions, and but then evaluating, what family traditions are good and what family traditions are not good,
Yeah.
and obviously empowering families that we can always change our family traditions if we find that there's just something in there that doesn't reflect our values, doesn't reflect the goodness that we want to stand for. And I mean, again, when I came to Canada, and this is what I spoke about last week, is that when I started studying Canadian history, and everybody labels it as boring, because it's not that many years of Canadian history, though. Before Canada became a country, there were many years of intrigue and very interesting things that were happening. The whole exploration of this new world that we called now North America. And again, if we don't study that, and now that I'm homeschooling and teaching kids in pods, I found that the more I dig into history, the more interesting it is and the more valuable it is, because I am seeing now some of the issues that were faced in the past
Mhm.
that we're facing again in the same country that those issues were first resolved.
Book of Ecclesiastes says there's nothing new under the sun.
So, and this is why we wanted today to talk about um, family traditions, because they bring cultural, like a historic cultural, I guess, identity for your family, but they also bring values in the family, and through our traditions, really, we teach our children what kind of people do we want them to be, what things to value, what things to celebrate, and what things to stand against.
In my book, The Red Mark on God's Forehead, um, I have a whole chapter on traditions because the whole purpose of the book is to discuss the traditions within Christianity to see whether they're biblical or not. And when I explore what traditions actually lay a foundation for, as Milena said, identity, because what you do defines who you are. And if you have certain practices that are a regular thing, then that becomes part of your identity. And so it's extremely important, especially at a young age, to lay proper traditions. One of
Yes.
the reasons why we wanted to talk about this is last night we celebrate. Today's the first. It's Passover, and then tomorrow begins the biblical feast of unleavened bread, which is 7 days long. But it's all usually amalgamated together, and it's 8 days of Passover. And these holidays, of course, are biblical ones. They're God's appointed times, but celebrating them together as a family makes them part of who we are as a person and also as a family. And so, as goes the family, so goes society. So
Yes.
the foundations and the values of the individual families will make up the values of society. And what you see going on in the universities, and I can't stress enough that parents are paying parents or students, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars to send their kids to supposedly institutions of higher learning And what they're actually getting for that is indoctrination into hateful ideology.
Well, and sometimes, and this is something that I have noticed also even before post-secondary education, that um, we've been saying that the public education system now is no longer serving the public. It is not reflecting the diversity, as we call it, um, as it's understood, because Canada is made of so many different nationalities. And this is what I always understood as diversity, just
Yeah.
having different cultural backgrounds. Um, and so now students are being told that their parents are wrong. You know, there was a time, and see, when I did my teacher education, I did it in New York State, in Buffalo, and I was actually there was a couple of Canadians in the classes there, especially in the literacy class. Um, so my Canadian classmates and I were really we noticed the contrast between the American culture and the Canadian culture. The Canadian culture kind of like you can be who you are culturally from whatever background you come, but you still be Canadian. In the American culture, we realized that there's a strong American culture, and that started from obviously from the beginning of the colonies that they wanted to create their own culture, while Canada kind of kept a mix of cultures and tried to accommodate the different cultures.
Yeah.
And so we were really surprised how little teachers of those who were studying to be teachers know about the different cultures. And there was a student in one of my classmates asked, well, how do I deal with a child that is a different color or different culture or something like that? So really, it wasn't part of the education system. Meanwhile, we as Canadians were like, well, what do you mean? Like, we all come from somewhere. You treat everybody as a human being because they are part of your country now,
Mhm.
you know? And so Canada, and we were so proud at the time that Canada was a place where you could have your culture and be Canadian and be accepted. Now that has quickly changed.
Mhm.
And the thing is, now the word diversity is out there more so than ever, but that has been lost,
Mhm.
that diversity. And I think part of those different riots, and different kind of clashes on the streets of Toronto and the big cities here in Canada come because of the education system
Mhm.
and what has been taught. I remember that when I came to Canada, I was in a high school that was in a new immigrant area,
Mhm.
and the cultural diversity was really a cultural diversity. You saw people from Europe, from Asia, from Africa, from all over the place in that community. And to me, that was exciting coming from a communist country where you could not travel and mingle with other cultures.
Right.
And I think partially um, prejudice towards other cultures in communist times was created because of the restrictions of where you could go, who you can communicate, so that radical ideas would not be passed on to you and you would
Mhm.
rebel against the regime. So, but when I came to Canada, I realized, hey, this is a good thing. I could interact with other cultures and not be afraid that I would adopt something wrong from them.
Mhm.
And it was a good mix until we started promoting diversity in schools. And all of a sudden, there's a lot more violence, there's a lot more hatred, there's a lot more.
Because diversity, what they do, what with the left, and I mean the left-right paradigm is just simply
It's
a
no
con.
longer,
Well,
yeah.
no, it's a construct, and it always
Yeah.
has been, and it's create. I mean, communism, fascism was the same thing. They were both created by the same people, and then had them
So
societies.
who brings that in though? Like that intolerance that
Well,
is labeled as
but
tolerance.
it's the globalists.
So it's
It's the
not right or left.
Well, the right left paradigm, when we talk about right or left, that originated from I think it was French Parliament, and used to have the more progressive people that were on the left side of um, the the building, and then the more
Yeah, in the
conservative
room.
people were on the right. That's all that meant. But you see, it's part of what's called the Hegelian dialectic, and Hegel was a socialist philosopher, and he created this this idea that what you essentially do is um, you've got thesis, you've got antithesis, and then you've got synthesis. And so what that means is that you've got people um, that aren't able to be controlled because they value freedom. So what you do is you create a crisis. It's manufactured, and you create chaos where people will go to the very people who have created the problem in order to solve the problem. And the solution is always the lack of individual rights, the lack of freedoms, the exercising of control,
Mhm.
so that whereas the people would have been up here to begin with, over here, okay, the people are up here to begin with, but they're not going to go down here to where the people, the tyrants want them to be. So what they have to do is they have to create an intermediary step and get them to go over here first, which is you create this crisis.
So, in other words, the conclusion is we don't have a right and left anymore in Canada or the US, really. You have a little bit more conservative, a little bit less conservative,
They
but
all
you
work for
don't.
this. No, they all work for the same team.
Okay, so what we are saying is, and I was just saying, like, we can't even use like the left, the right doing that, because now that is what is used to create division in our country.
100%.
So it is not the left anymore. It is the outside forces that is controlling our government that are creating
Yeah.
division within the country. And we didn't mean to be political. We wanted to do some family stuff here, but um, the reason families need to have strong traditions, because what happens is we have outside of our country influences that are dividing the people within the country. So the people are being more dissatisfied with their government, and they will one day ask for a one world government because
Listen,
they would want somebody to hold our government accountable, because right now Canada is being destroyed
yep, from the inside out, we're being handed over.
economically or otherwise.
Well, politically, economically, they're creating this UN charter, which is called the Pandemic Treaty. And what that's going to do is that the countries that sign on to that are going to give over sovereignty of their country to the World Health Organization. And if the World Health Organization has a twitch one day and decides, oh, we got a pandemic because they released something from a lab somewhere. So, I mean, it's all, pre-engineered.
Yeah.
Then that treaty overrides national sovereignty, which means that even our own governments won't be able to dictate policy for the country. And if the World Health Organization decides that countries need to be locked down and you can't exit your homes and stuff like that, then they will send out the military in order to be able to do that. And there's nothing that even politicians in our country who oppose that are going to be able to do.
So this is why we have our show and what we teach. We want to talk about strengthening of the family. We want to talk about opposing those external pressures on our families to change. So what I was saying is that even in schools now, students from different cultures are hearing that their parents are wrong if the value of their culture is not to embrace homosexuality
Mhm.
or other kind of identities, genders, and things like that, um, which really contradicts now what I saw, because I also follow the economics, because that affects families as well, with this halal mortgage that is
Yeah.
being introduced in Canada. So and I'm just looking at this and I'm thinking, I mean, I'm not Muslim, but I'm thinking, on one hand, the Muslim families were dissatisfied with the fact that some of the values that are being taught in the public school system go against their belief system, and
Yeah.
so does it goes against Christian or Jewish belief system as well,
Mhm.
because those are religions that believe in creation, and that there was a man and woman who were created first, and that's all there was to it.
Mhm.
And so on one hand, the education system's teaching that, but now we're trying to appease the Muslim community in our country by giving them halal mortgages. Well, And I've seen now there were discussions in mom groups and so forth because they're multicultural. Again, it's so beautiful the fact that all the groups are belong to, like a lot of parenting and mom groups are
Mhm.
multicultural. And so this one group, the moms were saying, okay, well, in the Christian Bible too, it says that if you lend money to someone, you should not be charging them the interest. So are we going to have kosher um, mortgages now too, because it is in the Torah, right?
Mhm.
And so and this is kind of a more example of how our culture, our society is being divided. People are being put against each other because now the Christians and Jews are going to ask, well, how come we are considering halal mortgages for Muslim families when Jewish and Christian families are just as much impacted by the economy that is happening in our country, and their religious texts also say that they, you know, cannot be charged. I mean, that is their belief too. And I know, like, I don't hold anything against any group. I know that this is our government's attempt to appease one community versus another community without, considering the multiculturalism and diversity.
No, it's called wedge politics. And what they do is they pit
Absolutely.
one group against another in order to keep us divided.
Yeah,
Because if we're angry at the Muslims, then we're not focusing on the real enemy, which is the government that is imposing all this stuff. And why would we need to have, these special mortgages? Well, it's because the government sets policy that allows the banks to charge usurious interest.
absolutely. And we are seeing a lot of families are being affected. Families are having to sell their homes, especially if they're newer purchases, right?
Mhm.
Because they can't afford to keep them. So this economy is affecting everybody the same, but now we're going to help this. So that's why I'm saying multiculturalism and inclusivity has been lost in our country, and we're going to help one. And it's all because of politics. I need this community to vote for me. I upset them a little bit too much with my education policy, so I'm going to give them like halal mortgages. And I hope our brothers and sisters, Muslim brothers and sisters, can see how that is being done, right?
Mhm.
But also, I hope Christians and Jews see that there are different issues in our society that are being created, and this is why there's this rioting on the streets, because we are being turned against one another.
Mhm. And it's
And,
all by design because, as Yeshua said, a house divided against itself cannot stand.
well, and this is why I wanted to get to the topic of today, which is the importance of family, I guess, unity, cultures, strengthening of the family.
Mhm.
Okay, because if our families are strong, then our society would not be divided so easily. Even if new philosophies and new ideas are being brought forth in our parliament, if we have a solid value system that we follow as a family and we pass it from generation to generation,
Mhm.
then we as a society will not be allowing these things. But at this point, I mean, I don't even know what the statistics are now, but last we checked, it was 50% divorce rate. Families fall apart 50% of the time,
Mhm.
which is a big percentage. Half the families, like out of two families, one is experiencing divorce, separation, or some kinds of um stuff that breaks the family down.
Well, even yesterday, we were at the passport office, and the woman beside us,
She had to come in and present divorce
the
papers.
separation papers, the divorce papers. There's another family that got blown up. I mean, it's everywhere around
It
us.
was sad, yeah. And because when you get a passport for your child, both parents have to be present, and or otherwise you have to present all these papers. And so if you even look at the passport office, it was half the people were there without a spouse to get documents on behalf of the children. So
We
what is
we
good?
we we got to wait around forever together.
Yes, we waited together. I mean, yeah, that's just another topic about governments and how to do that. But so what we want to talk about today is the importance of traditions and culture within your family, and keeping and holding strong to that no matter what the pressures are. And the other thing is, if we are to create a truly inclusive education system, then we are to be respectful of all the cultures that are present without giving in and becoming like any particular culture. It, and what I mean is, just because I accept Christian, Jewish, Muslims, Hindu kids in my class, and I've taught classes in Toronto that had all these cultures and religions. And you know what? Those kids, they all wanted to have conversation what their beliefs were, and I welcome that. And it was interesting because we got to learn what the other one believes, what was important to the other one, and we still respected the fact that we differed in what we believe, but that's what was important to us, and we had to accept that. Of course, I was the teacher, and then I had all these kids would ask me questions about what I believe. And you know what? And that was, when did I leave the school board? Well, that was over 15 years ago when I worked for the Toronto School Board, right? And I shared with the kids, and I let them share freely. And at the whole time, I was thinking the principal's probably going to call me up because I'm not supposed to talk to the kids about God.
Yeah.
That's a very important part of their identity. Especially, again, I actually went to teach back into the high school where I went to school. So it was, again, a new immigrant area. A lot of them were newcomers. They wanted to talk about their culture. They needed to feel safe to talk about it. And me, who was immigrant many years ago, I felt comfortable talking about it too. I thought it was nothing wrong with it. But now there's certain topics that you should kind of, oh, well, maybe you shouldn't talk about that in school, like God or things like that.
Because you're worried about getting censored. And it's, again, it's totalitarian. It's and the first thing that a totalitarian government and society would go after is free speech and independent thought.
Well, and I believe religious beliefs as well. I mean, they're under a lot of attack as well. So that's part of the identity and the culture of the families. And as I work with students, I know a lot of I have to be mindful because my Muslim students just recently were celebrating Ramadan, and well, they were very tired during the day. And I had to be aware of what they're doing. Like, I can't be completely oblivious because then they won't feel welcome and I can't address their needs, because we're talking about, well, we have to educate children by understanding who you're teaching and what their culture is. That doesn't, and so my other point though I was going to make, that doesn't mean that I have to celebrate Ramadan. That doesn't mean that I have to become Muslim, even though some of the moms in the group that we were discussing the whole new halal mortgage thing. One of the moms says, time to convert, so we can get, lower rates on mortgage. It was a joke, obviously. We don't have to convert to be treated equally, and that's where really the folly is. And the problem becomes with our society today, that what we call an inclusive society now caters to certain groups in certain areas. And we are being divided, not united.
And here's one of the techniques that the government will use. It'll take away rights, and then it'll give us back a little something so that'll pacify us. So a great example is when they put in the smart meters and started giving us time of use. Before 2000 and I can't remember, 3 or 4, whenever it was that Dalton McSquinty, the premier of Ontario, did that. It didn't matter what time of day you used electricity, it was the same price.
Yeah.
But then they put in time of use stuff, and then, well, during the day it was more expensive. So they're preventing everybody from functioning. So now you got to wait until the evening in order to do your laundry or whatever. Well, at first they said that the off-hour rates was going to be after 9 o'clock.
Yeah.
Well, everybody got into a hue and cry. And then the government said, oh, well, we'll drop it down to 7. And everybody went, okay, that I can live with. And so in the meantime, we have now accepted the fact that they're charging us twice as much during the day, when sometimes you got to do what you got to do.
During the day, that's when we do most of our stuff, hopefully.
Well, exactly. And that's why our electricity bills have gone up and everything else. And so what it does is it takes, and then it gives a little back and it placates us instead of, and it's the same thing with this carbon tax. I have petitions that are coming around saying, well, should heating oil be carbon tax exempt? And my answer is no. We shouldn't have heating oil carbon tax exempt. Why? Because the carbon tax in of itself is immoral and unethical, and we should have carbon tax on nothing except politicians. I think politicians should be carbon taxed 100%.
So, exactly. So we are being told, it's just like this. I mean, and that's the thing. The economic pressures affect the families, and the families now are being divided because parents. There was a time when one parent could go off to work, and mom would stay home and could raise the children.
Yeah,
And so now your family traditions are being changed by the social pressures of economics,
yeah,
and so we need to understand what is happening, and find our family traditions.
yeah.
um and this is what we encourage. And so if your family traditions are based on your religious beliefs, then absolutely have time of prayer with your children. I have to tell you, in our previous neighborhood before we moved into this home here,
Yeah.
our son befriended a brother and sister, two siblings,
Mhm.
who are Muslim.
Yeah.
And in First of all, I admired how their dad, first of all, the dad was single dad because the mom died tragically from
Cancer.
illness, cancer,
Yeah.
when the kids were still young. And so I have always taught our son to have compassion and to befriend kids, and just really be somebody who cheers them up and see how. And so he really befriended them, and he became good friends. And he said to me one day, when he was there, oh, well, his friend, the boy, had to go up to his room to do prayers because he was committed to prayer. And I said,
Mhm.
I was almost convicted as a Christian mom to, what? We should pray more often. You should be that dedicated to praying at a specific time, because our Bible too says that we should be praying, at least 3 times a day.
Mhm.
Um, as an example of Daniel and so forth, praying at certain times of the day.
Yeah.
And to me, being around other cultures, and who want to do good for themselves, not to use the culture against the other parts of our society,
Yeah.
but to be excellent, to serve a God they believe in. And that's admirable to me.
Well, and this is why, again, it's important that we do traditions like keeping the Passover. I mean, the whole reason why God has us do these annual things and the weekly Sabbath and all
Yeah.
these other appointed times is because He wants to remind us of what He's done. The reason why we keep the Passover is to remind us that Israel was delivered out of bondage from Egypt 3,500 years ago. And the reason why we can tell the story today like we do is because we commemorate it every year. And then, of course, with the Last Supper, the Passover is pointing toward the cross and how, Yeshua became the sacrifice for all of mankind so that we can be forgiven for our sins. And symbolically, we come out of spiritual Egypt, which is sin and darkness. So having a tradition like that is very important. Now, that's a biblical tradition, but the non-biblical ones, for instance, like a tradition can be a family eating together.
Yeah.
Eh,
I just wanted to add before I move from biblical traditions, or to religious traditions or spiritual traditions. Um, the Bible, and I know a lot of texts, spiritual texts, have historic component to them.
Yeah.
And so when we celebrate the Passover, um, to me, that has so much historic, again. So when you have a text like the Bible,
Mhm.
there's so much history. So there you are, you're teaching spirituality and good morals with the same book that you're teaching history
Yeah.
of the Jewish people and what God has done in the past. And so it's just so important and so enriching to have both of those elements in your traditions that are associated with the religious text or with the spiritual text that you follow.
Mhm.
um I just wanted to emphasize before you moved on, because to me, celebrating the Passover, and I know that I don't come of Jewish background like you do, and so when I started reading the Bible, to me, I saw that that was the tradition of the Jewish people. And my desire was to go to the Jewish people to learn more because it is the God I believe in. So I wanted to understand how this is being done. Because if we have this conviction to follow certain moral set of rules, then we need to understand how to do it properly because, well, we misinterpret things. We're human beings sometimes.
Well, and even, in First Corinthians chapter 11, Paul says to the Corinthians, I commend you for adhering to the traditions which I gave you. And there were a few things that Paul actually had positive to say about the Corinthian assembly. I mean, they were a wild bunch, but they did hold to the traditions that he gave them. And so you can't have a moral lifestyle. You can't keep the commandments of God without having traditions attached to it because, well, how do we do it? Now, what those traditions look like aren't really all that important. Like yesterday, we kind of mixed things up a bit from where we usually did because
Right.
there were the command is to remember the Passover. There's three things you're supposed to do. You're supposed to have the unleavened bread, the bitter herbs, and then the lamb. And we did have lamb. I went and got one the
It
other
was
day,
delicious.
and it was delicious. But there are other things that have been added over the years to the Jewish Passover table. Um, one of them is of pagan origin, so that's the egg. So
Well, we've been taking things off
yeah,
over the years. We took one element at a time because one thing with family traditions is what we want to do is we want to boil it down to what's the important thing to simplify.
especially the egg part.
Boil it down. Okay, got it.
Quick for you.
So, but the thing is, our traditions, and one of the things, again, I wanted to speak about the fact that our traditions should be making us better people and making us better for those around us, even if they don't follow our traditions. You know what I mean? So that the whole point of having traditions and having a moral system is so that you are a good person. And how do you know you're a good person? If those around you see you as a good person, like it's from the outside. If you are actually a blessing and a benefit to the people around you, our traditions should not be harmful to others around us. They should not be seen as something undesirable to be around by other
Well, you shouldn't
people.
be protesting at university campuses in favor of a terrorist group that murdered 1,200 people in cold blood last year. I mean,
Yeah.
it's absolutely sick to me that this is what our public education system has become. And I think that's part of the reason why now you have Biden forgiving student loans, which means you can take out a bunch of loans. But as long as you're getting the kind of education they want, then they're even willing to fund it for you.
Well, I have to tell you, I mean, even in Eastern Europe, paying tuition for university was unheard of until actually, Bulgaria is where I come from, but Eastern Europe, the government pretty much funded everything
Mhm.
because it wasn't an indoctrination machine. And it wasn't until we came into the European Union that we started paying, like the universities in Eastern Europe started paying students started paying tuition to the
Yeah.
universities.
So now you have to pay to become an idiot instead of it being free
Well,
before.
but now there's more options. Now you can go get your education at different institutions
Yes.
where you choose that your values align with, and you're not stuck in your own country like during communist time. You can only go to this university and you can only learn this.
Yeah.
So,
Like Henry Ford, you can have any color car you want as long as it's black.
exactly. Well, and that's the thing. Maybe families need to also consider, you know, um, we shouldn't when we came together again, I'm using my life a lot because I understand what it's like to be a newcomer and coming to this culture. And my parents said, well, get your education,
Mhm.
because that was a value of ours coming from Eastern Europe,
Yeah.
right? To get post-secondary university education. Like even college was frowned upon. Oh, college is just, a glorified high school,
Yeah.
get university education where you really
Those are
dig
for the
into.
dumb kids.
Well, and that was just a prejudice that was there within us because that was created. Like we came with that from our cultural background. And the thing is, but my parents said, get your university education and then your doors for career will open. Well, I got my Bachelor of Science and there were no doors open. I would call different labs and stuff like that. And I first of all, I learned that there's internal hiring. That's the first time I heard that term. We only hire the families of whoever is already within us. And I'm like, well, that sounds like communism, and
Well,
that
it's
was,
nepotism. It's just that it was practiced by the communists.
well, like you helped whoever benefited you. But anyway, so I realized, and I went through like really tough time in my mid 20s when I realized my Bachelor of Education was not going to give me the opportunity that I was promised. So here goes the Canadian dream and all those opportunities. So um after I kind of struggled a little bit and I went off the tracks, I came back and realized education is important. I went back, I did my teacher's college. And so at least I found the passion and what I wanted to do. But I was very disillusioned with our education system.
Yep. Well,
And
you saw for all that it.
and so it is good to keep your family values, but it's also good to find out, when you come from a different culture, how it's good for Canadians who live in Canada to find out how the government works and what you really get when you send your kids to university. I know education is great, but you have to start looking into really researching what the institution is. Go visit, go even sit in classes and see what's practiced there.
Well, the president of Columbia University is a an Arab woman, and after 9/11, she was interviewed. So 20 some odd years ago, she was interviewed and said terrorism is a legitimate form of protest. So there's no way we would have seen coming what's happening today, right? It's just it's mind-boggling. And if you look at the all of the major universities across the US, almost all of them are now led by progressive women. Like there's no men that are even leading these institutions
Which to
anymore.
me is really mind-boggling because we are saying that we don't need to um limit ourselves to men or women gender. So anyway, like they just, and
Listen,
it's a whole thing. So back to the family traditions, it is important for you to keep your cultural traditions, to keep but at the
well,
same time figure out what's happening in the country that you're living in, because as we found out when we came to Canada, there's freedom in Canada, except there's these restrictions and you have to pay this fee and this tax and this.
yep,
So you're free. And so we saw that because at least we were told in our communist country, the government said this is what we're going to do to you, and they did that to you. Here it was more subtle. Now it's the subtlety is gone.
yeah. Now
Now you're being taxed.
now our government is telling you you don't have a right. If you have opposing views, then you're a fringe minority with unacceptable views.
Right.
So making sure that you establish the right traditions, and it's not only the religious ones, but for instance, we have a tradition in our household that I read the Bible with my son every night, and then we pray together.
Yeah.
And this has been something that we've done since he was born. I read to him the Bible from the time he was born.
Yeah.
He and the cat would be beside me. Neither of them understood what I was talking about. But we established that tradition, and the fact that we read to him from the time that he was a baby. Well,
Well, he became an avid reader
he
after
developed
that.
a
Yeah.
love for learning, and
Yeah.
I told at his bar mitzvah last month that when he was 9 months old, he saw I was wearing a shirt with letters on it. He
Yeah.
pointed each of the letters and had me recite what the letter was.
Well, he somehow made the connection that all these stories we were reading to him had, were based on those letters. So
Yeah.
he now finally he wanted to learn the mystery of the letters,
Yeah.
So he has to read before,
Right.
gosh, how old was he? He was not even 3. He was 2, maybe 2.5.
Yeah.
So that's one of the importance of the family traditions. The other one is as the times are changing, and we're talking about economic, political,
Yeah.
just the world scene has changed, medical changes and all that stuff. Children more so than ever need this predictability, like you were talking, like the annual cycles
Mhm.
of the seasons that we're celebrating, so that we can connect with God and the creation of nature, but also to have this time that we value together as a family, and to remind us to be thankful for things, because usually celebrations we're very thankful for the meal we had yesterday.
Oh boy, were we ever.
Well, it's time to be festive and to
Well,
really
we had one guy who
appreciate.
traveled 3 hours to be with us yesterday because
Yes.
he really felt that it was something that he had to do. But the fact that he knew us, he was a friend of ours, and we opened up our home to him
Well,
and said, "Come on."
he's been lacking community,
Yeah.
and so he came to us, and that's it's up to some families, I think, for them to open their doors to the strangers. Well, I mean, this person was not a complete stranger to us, but it wasn't someone who's part of our family, right? But
Yeah.
he was lacking that family environment,
Mhm.
even within his own family. Not all the family members share his spiritual beliefs,
Mhm.
and so we need to, as a family, yes, there's the biological family, and we encourage, I just read something um about, people, who, in other words, people who are not divorced are people who refuse to give up on each other. You know what I mean? Like, you have to really work hard to keep the family together. Now, if the decision obviously was not made properly to begin with to get married, that's a different story.
Yeah.
But if you commit to one another, so those family traditions keep us together, remind us what we're thankful for, remind us the good things we had.
Yeah.
There's enough negative and hard things that go on in our daily lives, and
Mhm.
so when we have celebration, I mean, why do people love Christmas so much? Because of the fond memories, okay? We don't agree with the commercialism and the paganism and all that stuff because it goes against our beliefs.
Yeah.
But that's the importance of traditions. I mean, it's the world that goes crazy
Yeah.
now because people have been following their emotions too much without thinking critically. Now we're suckered into, I mean, people go into debt over buying Christmas presents.
Mhm.
That is not why we have family traditions.
No.
So we need to really be discerning, how do our traditions affect those around us, affect us and our family's well-being.
Mhm. And but you see, positive traditions that you implement too, and one of the other ones that we have is that our family always eats together.
Yes.
And it is a demonstrable fact that families that eat together tend to stay together more. Um, too much of this individualized society where people come and go, you don't develop those connections that you need to, and a lot of relationships are cultivated and intimacy is developed over food. It's a biblical value. I mean, you look at cultures that value food like Italy or France or something like that.
Most cultures, their holidays are around feasts.
Yep. But also it's, I talk about in church services, for instance, and I've preached at hundreds of churches over the years, and most of them the service is finished and everybody kind of peters out after that, or books out the door.
Yes.
Where you do, but how do you develop relationships with people if you're all sitting there and supposed to be paying attention to what the guy at the front is saying and not interacting with each other?
Well, this is like people saying, oh, how would you socialize your homeschool kids? Meanwhile, the kids go to school and they can't talk during class time, and they only have like a little bit of outlet in between classes,
Yeah.
and they go crazy, and there's all kinds of stuff that happens,
Yeah,
the
it's
recess. So,
it's
so we have
completely
to
innate.
really, really think that um, what we really connect during the times of celebrating
Yeah.
something, and I think thankfulness, though, it's a big part of our celebrations.
Yeah.
I'm just going to direct families to, I just found this article. We follow Focus on the Family Canada, and there is an article actually called 100 Fun Family Traditions. And some of them are neutral, like we talked about. Some are actually faith-based, like for example, when the kids are going back to school, you can pray over them, bless their backpacks, and so these are kind of faith-based, but others are things that are very, very neutral,
Mhm.
having like tech-free time and doing. We
Mhm.
have to make sure that the traditions we develop, I mean, are also building good character in our children's, because
Mhm.
we can't have a tradition of playing violent games, during Saturday night or something like that, and think, well, we have a family tradition, but that's not a good one. Again, good family traditions should keep the family together,
Yeah.
should make us good neighbors
Yeah.
to those around us and people of different cultures. And they should also um, be a way to bless our society, not to take away from it and
Yeah.
not to demand something from it.
Mhm. Yeah. Traditions are very, very important because it establishes routines that become part of your identity. And when, personal traditions like, working out or whatever the case may be,
Mhm.
provide tremendous value. But if the traditions are wrong, then it's going to lead us away. And if you get involved with things
Yeah.
that take you away from those good values. So, routine is very important in the life of any human being. And, but most especially with our children, because when you establish those routines and those patterns in their lives at a young age,
Yeah.
it goes back to train up a child in the way he should go. Having a tradition of making sure that the table is cleaned off after dinner instead of everybody just leaving and leaving it for someone else.
Yes.
Um, and you could go on and on and on. And so the emphasis, as we've come into the spring feasts, we have, Passover. We've just celebrated last night. We've got unleavened bread, which starts tonight. And the tradition is that you clean your house at 11 because you want to find where all the
Actually, you know what? This has been interesting because our family, another family, as we are celebrating Passover,
yeah,
God has really emphasized to us that we really need to get rid of stuff of our houses
yeah,
that have emotional attachment that is unhealthy
yeah,
or spiritual, or promoting the wrong spirituality. For them, particularly, was this year was get rid of the Disney stuff. And those
yeah.
of you who know why
Yeah.
Disney is no good for your
All right,
family.
we've come to the end. So
Yes. So you will know, and so make sure that your traditions are really, we get to demonstrate how to be good people to
yeah.
our children.
So we want to thank everybody for joining us again. We'll see you next week here on Smarten Up.
Bye bye for now.
Bye.
We are richly blessed to bring you what we believe is the fullest, most diverse, yet up-to-date progressive teachings, discussion, and prayer programming you can find anywhere on this planet. Be sure to take the tour of the MessianicLambRadio.com website. I'm Susan Hoogie, thanking you for joining us on the Messianic Lamb Video Network.